I want to begin with a paradox that makes many people uncomfortable because it cuts against everything they've been told is responsible economic thinking. The paradox is this: the more aggressively governments try to stabilize the economy, the more violently instability tends to emerge later. What feels like safety in the short term often becomes fragility in the long term. And fragility, when it finally breaks, doesn't whisper, it explodes. That is why I chose the words I chose. This is going to explode. Not because markets are irrational, not because innovation is dangerous, but because we have built an economic system that systematically underprices change, suppresses volatility, and punishes long-term thinking in the name of short-term comfort. I've spent my career studying innovation, capital allocation, and technological disruption. I've lived through cycles where investors were convinced that this time is different meant risk had disappeared. And I've lived through the aftermath, when reality reasserted itself with extraordinary force. What I'm seeing now, as we move toward 2026, is not just another cycle. It's a collision between exponential technologies and linear institutions, a collision between decentralized innovation and centralized control, a collision between human creativity and systems that increasingly distrust it. Let me be very clear about something up front. I am optimistic, deeply optimistic. Innovation is the most powerful deflationary force humanity has ever known. It expands access, lowers costs, increases productivity, and raises living standards over time. But optimism does not mean denial. Optimism requires honesty, and honesty requires acknowledging that the path from here to there is not smooth. What most people miss is that innovation doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't care about regulatory comfort zones, political narratives, or legacy business models. It moves where capital, talent, and freedom intersect. And when that movement is obstructed, pressure builds. Think about what we have layered on top of the global economy over the last decade. Unprecedented monetary expansion, massive fiscal interventions, interest rates held artificially low for extended periods, capital misallocation on a scale we've never seen outside of wartime, all of it justified by good intentions, stability, inclusion, protection. But markets don't respond to intentions. They respond to incentives. When you suppress the cost of capital, you encourage leverage. When you guarantee bailouts, you encourage risk without accountability. When you punish price signals, you distort reality. And distortion doesn't disappear. It compounds. At the same time, something extraordinary has been happening beneath the surface. 5 innovation platforms have been converging: artificial intelligence, robotics, energy storage, blockchain technology, and genomics. Each one of these platforms on its own would be transformative. Together they are revolutionary. Artificial intelligence is no longer a tool. It's becoming an infrastructure layer. Robotics is moving from controlled environments into the physical economy. Energy storage is reshaping how power is generated, distributed, and consumed. Blockchain is challenging the very definition of trust and ownership. And genomics is turning biology into an information science. These technologies are not incremental, they are exponential. Their cost curves are collapsing, their capabilities are accelerating, and their adoption is faster than almost any prior technological wave in history. Now here is the uncomfortable truth that very few policymakers want to confront. Exponential systems do not coexist peacefully with centralized control for long. Eventually, one gives way. Governments are responding to this wave of innovation not with humility, but with fear. Fear of losing control over money, fear of losing control over labor markets, fear of losing control over narratives, and fear, when it guides policy, produces fragile outcomes. Look at how capital is being directed today. Enormous subsidies aimed at preserving legacy structures, regulations designed to slow down newcomers rather than force incumbents to adapt, monetary policies that attempt to smooth every downturn, eliminating the very signals entrepreneurs rely on to allocate resources efficiently. This is where the pressure builds, because while institutions move slowly, Technology does not. While regulations debate, code ships. While committees meet, models learn. And while policymakers argue about fairness in theory, markets discover efficiency in practice. By 2026, we are likely to see the consequences of this mismatch surface very clearly, not as a single event, but as a cascade. Asset prices that have been propped up by cheap capital will be forced to reconcile with cash flows. Business models that survived on financial engineering rather than innovation will be exposed. Labor markets will experience rapid reskilling pressures that centralized systems are not prepared to handle. This is why I say this is dangerous. Not because innovation destroys jobs, but because resisting innovation destroys adaptability. History is unambiguous on this point. Societies that embrace creative destruction grow wealthier and freer over time. Societies that attempt to freeze economic structures in place stagnate, then fracture. The fracture is what people mistake for chaos, when in reality it is delayed adjustment. What worries me is not volatility. Volatility is information. What worries me is the systematic effort to eliminate volatility at the policy level while simultaneously accelerating technological change. That combination is unstable. Let's talk about money, because this is where the tension becomes impossible to ignore. Money is information. It tells us where value is being created and where it is being destroyed. When central authorities manipulate that signal too aggressively, they blind the system. Digital assets emerged not because people wanted speculation, but because they wanted alternatives. Alternatives to opaque systems, alternatives to discretionary dilution, alternatives to rules that change after the fact. Whether people like it or not, this is a rational response to centralized uncertainty. Trying to suppress that response does not eliminate it, it radicalizes it. The same dynamic applies to work. Artificial intelligence will automate tasks. That is unavoidable. The question is not whether jobs will change, but whether individuals are allowed the freedom to adapt. Education systems built for the industrial age are not equipped for this transition. Lifelong learning, flexible credentialing, and entrepreneurial experimentation are essential. Yet many policies still assume static careers and centralized job creation. This is another pressure point. When individuals are denied agency, they don't become safer. They become brittle, and brittle systems fail suddenly. Now let me shift to something that is often misunderstood about my perspective. I am not anti-government. I am pro-innovation, pro-market, and pro-individual freedom. Government has a role to protect property rights, enforce contracts, and provide a stable legal framework. But when government attempts to replace decentralized decision-making with centralized judgment, it oversteps its competence. No committee can outthink millions of individuals responding to real-time information. No regulator can anticipate every second-order effect of exponential technology. And no model can replace the adaptive intelligence of free people. The explosion I'm warning about is not a collapse of innovation. It's a collapse of the illusion that innovation can be centrally managed. Markets will reprice risk. Capital will flow toward productivity. Talent will migrate to jurisdictions that respect experimentation, and systems that resist this reality will experience stress, not because they are unlucky, but because they are misaligned. What makes this moment especially volatile is that the general public has been taught to associate stability with fairness. In reality, fairness comes from opportunity, not from enforced uniformity. Innovation widens opportunity over time, but only if people are allowed to participate. If access to capital is restricted, inequality grows. If access to education is rigid, inequality grows. If access to ownership is controlled, inequality grows. And this is where decentralized technologies become politically dangerous. They don't ask permission. They don't require gatekeepers. They enable participation at the edges. That is deeply threatening to centralized power structures. By 2026, the tension between these two models will be impossible to ignore. One model is based on control, predictability, and top-down management. The other is based on adaptability, experimentation, and bottom-up discovery. Only one of these scales in an exponential world. I want to leave you, for now, with this thought, because it sits at the center of everything I've said. Economic systems do not break because people are greedy or fearful. They break because they are designed in ways that deny reality. And reality has a way of asserting itself all at once, after being ignored for too long. The question we should all be asking ourselves is not whether disruption is coming. It is whether we are building systems that can absorb it or systems that will shatter when the pressure finally releases. Because pressure does not disappear when you ignore it. It accumulates, and when it finally releases, it doesn't negotiate. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable because it forces us to separate freedom from comfort. Over the last several decades, we've been conditioned to believe that the purpose of economic policy is to minimize discomfort at all costs, smooth growth, predictable outcomes, guardrails everywhere. But progress has never worked that way. Progress emerges from experimentation, from failure, from signals that tell us when something is wrong so it can be fixed. When you remove those signals, you don't create safety, you create blindness. Innovation thrives on feedback. Prices are feedback. Profit and loss are feedback. Volatility is feedback. And when policymakers treat feedback as a flaw rather than a feature, they end up amplifying the very risks they claim to be reducing. That's why I keep coming back to 2026. Not because it's a magical date, but because timelines matter when exponential curves intersect with rigid systems. Many of the policies enacted over the last decade were justified as temporary measures, emergency responses, transitory interventions. Yet here we are, years later, still operating under assumptions that no longer reflect reality. At the same time, the technologies I mentioned earlier are reaching inflection points. Artificial intelligence is moving from augmentation to autonomy. Robotics is crossing cost thresholds that make human substitution economically inevitable in certain tasks. Energy storage is reshaping geopolitics by reducing dependence on centralized grids and fossil fuels. Blockchain is challenging not just financial intermediaries, but institutional trust itself. And genomics is redefining healthcare from treatment to prevention. These shifts are not evenly distributed. They don't roll out politely across sectors. They hit where incentives allow them to hit, and that creates winners and losers faster than political systems can respond. Here is where the real danger lies. When societies mistake disruption for injustice and respond by suppressing innovation instead of expanding access to it. If you restrict AI development to a handful of regulated entities, you don't protect workers, you entrench monopolies. If you over-regulate decentralized finance, you don't protect consumers, you push innovation offshore. If you politicize energy transitions, you don't protect the environment. You slow down the very technologies that could scale clean abundance. This is not speculation. We've seen it before. Capital is mobile. Talent is mobile. Ideas are unstoppable. When freedom is constrained in one place, innovation migrates to another. What happens then is subtle at first. Productivity growth slows. Entrepreneurship declines. Young people disengage. Asset bubbles form as capital chases yield instead of value creation. And policymakers respond with more intervention, convinced that the problem is insufficient control. That is the feedback loop that leads to explosions. I want to talk about risk, because risk has been profoundly misunderstood in recent years. Risk is not volatility. Risk is the permanent loss of capital. And ironically, the attempt to eliminate volatility often increases real risk by encouraging complacency. When investors believe that downside has been socialized and upside remains private, behavior changes. Leverage increases. Due diligence declines. Speculation replaces innovation. And eventually, something breaks. The reason I remain optimistic is that innovation resets these dynamics. It forces repricing. It exposes inefficiencies. It rewards adaptability. But the reset is rarely gentle when distortions have been allowed to grow unchecked. By 2026, many of the assumptions underpinning today's valuations, labor structures, and policy frameworks will be tested simultaneously, not sequentially, simultaneously. And this brings me to the most politically sensitive issue of all: individual agency. Innovation empowers individuals. It lowers barriers to entry. It democratizes tools that were once reserved for institutions. That is profoundly liberating and profoundly destabilizing to centralized authority. A teenager with a laptop and an internet connection can now build products, access global markets, and challenge incumbents in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago. That is not a threat to society. It is the engine of societal progress. But only if individuals are allowed to keep the fruits of their experimentation. When taxation becomes punitive rather than proportional, experimentation declines. When regulation becomes prescriptive rather than protective, innovation slows. When narratives frame success as exploitation rather than value creation, ambition erodes, and ambition matters. Not the caricature of greed, but the drive to solve problems, to improve systems, to build something better than what came before. The most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that equality of outcome can substitute for equality of opportunity. It cannot. Equality of outcome freezes hierarchies in place. Equality of opportunity disrupts them. Innovation is the great equalizer over time, but only when individuals are free to participate. That is the truth many are unwilling to accept, because it requires tolerating short-term disruption for long-term gain. As we approach 2026, the pressure to choose between control and freedom will intensify, and that choice will determine whether the coming explosion is creative or destructive. Creative explosions redistribute opportunity. Destructive explosions redistribute blame. The difference lies in whether societies allow markets to clear, prices to signal, and individuals to adapt, or whether they double down on suppression, hoping complexity will yield to authority. I want to be very precise here. Freedom is not chaos. Freedom is a system of rules that are stable, transparent, and predictable, within which individuals are free to experiment. Markets are not perfect, but they are self-correcting when allowed to function. Central planning is neither. The truth I promise to reveal is this: liberty is not the absence of volatility. It is the presence of choice. And choice is the only mechanism capable of navigating exponential change without catastrophic failure. We can either allow millions of decentralized decisions to continuously adjust the system, or we can attempt to impose coherence from the top down and accept that when it fails, it will fail all at once. That is what I mean when I say this is going to explode. The explosion is not innovation running wild. The explosion is the collision between exponential progress and systems designed for a slower, simpler world. And here is the irrefutable conclusion. The more we try to protect people from change by restricting freedom, the more violent the eventual adjustment becomes. The only sustainable path forward is to expand access, not control outcomes, to educate for adaptability, not compliance, to trust individuals more than institutions. My call to action is not political. It is intellectual. Question the assumption that stability equals justice. Question the idea that centralized control can outpace decentralized intelligence. Question narratives that frame freedom as dangerous and dependency as compassionate. Read history, study innovation. Follow incentives, not slogans. And most importantly, insist on systems that respect the creative capacity of individuals. Because in an exponential world, freedom is not optional. It is the only thing that scales. By 2026, the tension between these two models will be impossible to ignore. One model is based on control, predictability, and top-down management. The other is based on adaptability, experimentation, and bottom-up discovery. Only one of these scales in an exponential world. I want to leave you, for now, with this thought, because it sits at the center of everything I've said. Economic systems do not break because people are greedy or fearful. They break because they are designed in ways that deny reality. and reality has a way of asserting itself all at once after being ignored for too long. The question we should all be asking ourselves is not whether disruption is coming. It is whether we are building systems that can absorb it or systems that will shatter when the pressure finally releases.